So let's talk about what was happening on the other side of the big pond over in America back in the 1600s and through the 1700s. In other words, we're going to talk about American Psalmody. Being Puritan and Calvinistic, they sang the Psalms. They'd been metricized, but they sang the Psalms. Now, before we enter into any major discussion about America and the culture there, we have to understand we're really talking about two different cultures. There's the culture in the north that was begun by the Plymouth colony, as you know, in 1620. And then there was the colony in the south, which I think could be described from Jamestown on. Both spoke English, but they had different foundations. Plymouth was it was radical Puritans who were pilgrims coming to America for the sake of religious freedom. In Jamestown, they had come, I guess, for commercial purposes to establish a colony and sell and trade tobacco. So very different purposes at the beginning, though you wouldn't necessarily know that from the end. Up in the north, there was a tendency toward intellectual direction. The establishment of Harvard, the Puritan churches wound up calling themselves quite often congregational churches because that was their structure. Many of them have since then, in the 1800s and so forth, moved in the direction of Unitarian. And others have become Friends or Quakers. And so it was sort of a tendency toward liberal and intellectual discussions of moral truth that took over on Sunday mornings. In the South, they tended to be much more experiential and expressive, and wound up becoming much more conservative theologically. So Southern Baptists, Churches of God, Assemblies of God, all of these are down across what even today could be considered the Bible Belt. Very strongly church-oriented and conservative in theology compared to the North. Very different cultures. In the North, they're much more emotionally distant, I think it would be easy to say, slower to become friends with strangers. In the South, that we know about Southern hospitality. Musically, shape notes were invented in the North. They wound up finding their way through Virginia and to the South, and even today in some churches they sing shape notes. In the South, well, that's the thing we have to start with. Let's talk about that. Again, our story must begin with the Northern Branch Psalmody, and to talk about that. Well, you're aware that the Pilgrims sang the Book of Psalms, and so they had a Bay Psalm book, first book published in America in 1640. And in the introduction to it, Cotton Mather said, among other things, God's altar needs not our polishings. It was his way of saying, we are not about writing great poetry, we are just trying to, line by line, stay with what the Book of Psalms says. Now, he was alluding to the fact that when God told the Israelites to build an altar, he said, don't cut the rocks, don't chisel that down, don't mortar them together. I just want the natural rocks to be together. Consequently, Psalm 23 began like this. The Lord to me as shepherd is, want therefore shall not I. He in the folds of tender grass doth cause me down to lie. Well, for sure, God's altar did not receive any polishing, I think it would be fair to say. By the time they got through the 1600s and all the way to the 1700s, the singing, by most anyone's account in these Puritan churches, was lethargic and awkward. They knew fewer and fewer tunes because nobody used music. Nobody knew how to read music. Everyone sang variations of the tune along the way. So nobody knew exactly what the original tune was supposed to have been, and it sort of varied from one congregation to another. The tunes were lined out. What that means is that a leader would sing,
Grace, how sweet the sound,
and then everybody would echo back.
Amazing grace, how
So every
sweet
hymn
the
took
sound.
twice as long to begin with, but then in between each of those exchanges, there was a little bit of a lag and a pause. It was just dreadful. The singing was dreadful. So, in the early 1700s, some began to advocate for what they called regular singing. In other words, singing by note. That would help to improve congregational singing because at least we would be able to see what the original tune was. Everybody in the congregation were able to sing music, and we were to print the tune. It's an idea whose time had come, and thus were introduced singing schools in America in the early 1700s. Among the first of these guys who created singing schools was John Tufts, and he had a direction for singing that involved really just 4 different notes. If you think about it, we have a series of whole steps and half steps in our scale, and what we consider to be a 7-note scale goes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Well, you could put each of those 7 different notes on a different line, but no matter what key you're in, if you use a different shape for each of the notes, why, this is brilliant. All you have to do is learn those 7 different shapes, and wherever you see do, you know that it's a do because it's shaped like that. But as some thought through this, they came to realize that in a sense there only need to be 4 shapes because there are only 4 different notes. There's fa. Now fa has a half step below it and a whole step above it, and then you've got sol and la as notes that are surrounded by whole steps. In order to sing the 7, you'd sing fa, sol, la, mi. Got it? All right, much, much simpler. As long as you stay diatonic, all is going to be well. When you start to get beyond the natural scale, then it gets a little complicated. Well, the original version of this didn't even need notation, didn't need shapes. You simply needed to identify which of those 4 notes, fa, sol, la, or mi, was being sung. And so here's a tune right here, Southwell New, published there in the early 1700s. And then you see it jumped up a line, and then you don't have a dot, so it's going to go faster. Then you jump it down again.
Fa, sol, mi.
Try that again.
Sol, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, la, sol, mi.
And the whole thing is all contained with just letters and dots. And, wow, that seems pretty simple. Doesn't count for everything, and all you have is quarter notes and eighth notes at that point, but it worked for some tunes. Well, let's move on to the next generation of singing schools where they introduced notation in a shape note system. There was William Billings, Daniel Reed, that sounds interesting, Samuel Holyoake, Oliver Holden, Andrew Laws, and many others. I think let's just explore Daniel Reed, who has more tunes currently in the Sacred Harp than any of the others.